I've always wanted to post something on Let's Not Meet, because I've been reading posts on this subreddit since I was little. I can't say I'm too pleased to have an experience to post now that it's actually happened. I haven't really told anybody this story, because I didn't want to freak out any of my friends, so I've limited it to just my mom and a few close friends. Well, I suppose now you'll know. So, let's begin. So how my friend group works is that we have our little circle of people who we hang around with most often, but for big events or bonfires or something similar, we expand and a couple of different friend groups join one. Ben is a part of one of these extended friend groups. He's someone who always posts different and interesting things, who always has something to say. I've gotten along really well with Ben at these events, and we always end up chatting. I've always found him to be a different and unique individual. Ben started going to my local college this year. He shot me a Snapchat basically saying, "Hey, all my friends went away to different schools, and the only person I have to talk to from the area is now my ex-girlfriend. I was wondering if you wanted to get a group together maybe and hang out, because I'd like to have some new friends around." It was actually a really nice message, because with the course I'm in, I don't get to make many friends, and all my close friends are spread out now too, so I said yes. The hangout was initially supposed to be one of my friends, him, and one of his friends. It was a day after class, and I just got home. He told me he was going to take a quick nap before we all head out. When he wakes up, he tells me it's now too late, and he has other plans he forgot about. That's totally fine. I wasn't really upset about it. I cancel with my friend too, so I can just sit down and do some homework. He texts me a few hours later. I didn't give him my number. How did he find it? Telling me his other plans got canceled, and he was now available again. He wanted to know if I still wanted to do something. I said that my friend was now out of the city, and he said he texted his friend but they didn't answer. He decided to pick me up and go for a drive and just chat. Normal enough. Ben gets to my house at around 10. I go and hop into his car and he speeds off. Oddly enough, he's talking in a weirdly accented voice, kind of like Jamaican or something similar. I thought he was just trying to be goofy, so I played along. Sometimes I would answer back in the accent, but then I started to think how it was weird that he wasn't talking in his own voice at all. He was driving like a maniac down the street, telling me how he was drinking earlier because he thought he was going to a party. I asked him if he was drinking and driving, and then he said that he'd only had a few sips. I know I probably should have gotten out of the car then, but at this point we were flying down the highway, and I was pretty scared. He begins to rant about his ex, telling me that there was infidelity and trust issues on his end, and he couldn't tell me what they were because he didn't want me to think badly of him. He told me he was still going to marry this girl and have her children. He ranted about her and got on tangents and started to scream and yell. I started to think that he was probably on some drug or something. We arrived at my college, a half-hour to 40-minute drive away in another city, and he says we should get out of the car. I'm already scared and my phone is dying, so I just listen to what he says. At this point, I'm literally thinking he might kill me. He took me for a walk through the light woods, and then started to make sounds like a creature. It was weird. He would make like dinosaur sounds, or sounds like from The Grudge. He would also walk like a creature, morphing his body into these weird, creepy movements. I requested for us to go home right away because I was literally terrified. We get back into the car and start our drive home. He pulls out a pipe and smokes something. I told him he shouldn't do that while he was driving, but he just didn't listen. Now he begins to yell. He starts back on his tangents about life again. He pulls over the car to get out and do some jumping kicks. At this point, my phone is dead. He gets back into the car and puts on his favorite song. The song begins slow and then picks up a little later. It's about a 4-minute song. He begins to scream along with the lyrics and smash the windows and dashboard with his hands, stomping his feet around. I've seen someone passionate about a song before, but not like this. Ben swerves all around the road until we finally get to my house. Then he turns to me and says without an accent, "I know it's late, but did you want to have sex?" In the most casual tone in the world. I gave a nervous laugh and said, "Actually, I'm good." He turned to the back seat to get something, but I got out of my car and booked it into my house. I locked the door right away, and the bedroom door in my room, as if I thought he would break in or something. It might not sound as terrifying as it was for me in the moment, but at the time I was shaking out of pure fear. I don't know if he was just on some crazy drug or if he had a split personality or something, but I've never met a person before who I've looked at and thought to myself, "You are going to kill someone one day." I really hope he doesn't see this, because I actually see him at school quite frequently. So, yeah, what a fun life. So this happened a few months ago. I'm a sophomore in college and was traveling down to my hometown over break. I was having some relationship issues with my stepmom, so I didn't want to stay at my dad's house the night I arrived at my hometown. I phoned a friend of mine from high school to see if I could stay over at his place. I knew from social media that he was still in town, and I'd stayed at his place before, so I knew there would be a place for me if they could allow it. My friend, let's call him Z, seemed like a pretty normal dude. We weren't the best of friends or anything, but we got pretty close by the time we had graduated. We would occasionally text or hang out if I was in town and catch up with each other, reminisce on the times we spent in orchestra or English class. When I called, he seemed extremely enthusiastic. Z's a normally upbeat guy, but this time it seemed like he was getting ready to get a brand new car. I didn't really think about it at the time, and he said I could sleep in the guest room, so I headed right over. When I got to his house, he was just as excited as he had been on the phone. He was bringing up stuff to do like getting high and watching weird movies or just playing video games together. Z's parents weren't home, so he really wanted the opportunity to smoke. I was pretty tired from the drive, but since we rarely see each other, I thought a little bit of bonding time couldn't hurt. We played Smash Bros, smoked some weed, and just chatted for a few hours. It was longer than I had wanted, but I was having fun, so whatever, right? By the time it was getting late at around 2 a.m., he started asking some pretty weird questions. If I ever wondered what it was like to kill someone, or if I thought anyone would miss me when I was gone. This, along with some pretty normal questions like if I had a boyfriend, or how my parents were doing, or if I was making friends at school. They all gave me a weird feeling. I was confused in the moment, but it didn't hit me until after that Z could be assessing me for something bad. The weirdness of it all made me just want to go right to bed. We stopped the game and both went into the basement, where his room and the guest room were. We say goodnight. I go to my room and get ready for bed. I'm having a little trouble sleeping, just some insomnia that I've had for a while, so I stay awake for around an hour until I hear some slight movement outside my room. The walls were all pretty thin, so I could hear footsteps walking past my door and up the stairs to the main floor, then back down quickly after. What struck me as odd was that I didn't hear the basement door open. It creaks very loudly when it does. The light didn't turn on either, so I was confused what Z was doing. I heard him go back into his room, but I just had this odd feeling. Ever since I met him this night, he seemed to be a lot different than he's ever been. I decided to look him up on social media and Googled to see if anything was out of the ordinary. Everything seemed normal, until I found his Tumblr, which was linked from his inactive Twitter account that I found on my Twitter contacts list. His Tumblr was, well, disturbing. There were graphic drawings of mutilated bodies of humans and animals, links to suspicious-looking websites that I didn't dare to click on, text posts and stories about murdering, cannibalism, necrophilia, and torture. There were also photos of guns, knives, and axes, which after looking closely were taken in his bedroom. The last post, around a week prior, was a text post from the account saying he wished he could find someone easy to kill like a homeless person. I was immediately filled with dread. I knew he was going to do something. He must have gone up the stairs to lock the door. I packed my things. Luckily, I had packed very lightly, and opened up this small window at the top of my bedroom's wall. I started to desperately climb through. As I was pulling my legs through, he opened the door. It was dark, but the streetlight illuminated enough for me to see he was carrying something long and skinny, probably a knife. He didn't say anything. I didn't either. I just turned around, hopped in my car, and drove as fast as I could to my dad's house. I immediately blocked him everywhere and reported his Tumblr account, but not before telling the police. They said they couldn't do anything, as the guns were legally registered under his dad and he hadn't actually done anything yet. Nevertheless, I told my other high school friends not to hang out with him. Ever since then, I've been creeped out whenever I meet new people. Just the realization that someone I knew so well could underneath be this person who could hurt me so bad, could want to kill me. I don't know what he's doing now, and I'm not sure I want to, but I hope he's getting some help. So this happened to me last semester. I'm a college student and I've only had positive experiences, except for this encounter I had throughout the entirety of the last semester. Just a disclaimer, this will probably be long, but I tried to space out the paragraphs for it to be easier to read. I'm a psychology major, and between taking AP classes in high school and taking a few extra classes over the summer, I'm already ahead of my class. Last summer I registered for a neuroscience course, which was a bit more advanced, and all the kids in the class were either juniors or seniors about to graduate. On the first day of class, I made my way to the classroom, and the professor was late. There was a big crowd of people outside, and I simply asked a boy if he was waiting for the same class. He said yes. He introduced himself to me as Braxton, and that was that. The professor came, and the class was pretty good. At the end of class, he asked me for my number, just in case we had to discuss homework assignments and whatnot, and I thought he would be a cool connection to have. Boy, was I wrong. I saw him about twice a week for an hour and a half. Not even 2 weeks after I met him, only seeing him in class, he stated that he felt a connection to me, and that I was the most beautiful and fascinating girl he had ever met. I ignored the connection part of it and thanked him for his compliment. That was that. The week after he mentioned this, he had texted me asking me out of nowhere if I had anxiety. I hesitantly said yes and kept it very broad. I told him that large crowds of people are my biggest trigger, but I managed just fine. He made it a point to tell me that if I ever needed to escape, he knew a few spots that were vacant and deserted. I told him I was fine and he seemed to drop it. The week after, we said our goodbyes and I started walking to my next class. Usually we say goodbye, and I don't see him until class 2 days later. He turned around quickly and started walking next to me. I told him that I was fine and that he could go to his own class. He said, No, it's fine. I want to walk you to math. I know people scare you." I stopped dead in my tracks and asked him how he knew I had math class after our NS class. He told me not to worry about it. As much as I was weirded out, I decided to ignore it. Keep in mind, I never once told him my schedule, or really anything about myself. He dropped me off and I felt relief thinking that was that. I brushed it off as him just trying to be a little gentleman. An hour and a half later, he was waiting for me right outside the room and then said, "Let's get you to English." I lied and told him that my English class had been cancelled, and alarms had gone off in my head. Apparently this kid knew my whole schedule, and where classes were located and what times. Although I again ignored it because I didn't want to be rude to him, I took it as him trying to be nice, so I tried to forget about it. After that incident, everything seemed to return to normal, until it wasn't. As stated earlier, I have some pretty bad anxiety, and on this day in particular I was having a pretty off day. Class started and I grew more and more anxious and had to step out, so I did. I went to the bathroom and calmed myself down, and returned quietly, only to notice that Braxton was not in his seat. He came back soon after and took his seat right behind me, and immediately whispered in my ear, "Don't you ever leave without my permission again. Do you understand me?" I just nodded and apologized so he would stop, and then he returned back to normal. One of his few obsessions with me was that something would happen to me, and that he had to protect me at all costs. If I wasn't okay, he would flip out and do anything in his power to return me to an okay state. It was odd. There were a few instances in which it got really freaky. One of these instances was the day he noticed my medical bracelet for hypoglycemia. As soon as he noticed it, he started interrogating me about why I had it, what it was, if I take medications, when was my last episode. He then proceeded to grab my hand to try and snap a picture of my parents' phone numbers on the back. I told him it wasn't his business, and if he really needed that information one day he would have it, on my wrist. He got upset but dropped it. That Friday he had called me from his job. He worked at a hospital doing office-type work, and said, "Hey, I have you on speaker, and I'm with one of my colleagues. I need you to explain your condition, why it happens, and give me a list of medications you take." I told him that it was completely out of line, and hung up on him. He blew up my phone telling me how important it was to get help, and how important it was for him to know everything about it. I started ignoring him. The next time I saw him, he acted normal and even apologized for his actions. We moved on until the next thing. I had twisted my ankle pretty bad on campus, and I had been crying. It was pretty obvious I was in pain and stressed. As soon as he saw me, he completely flipped out, asking who did this to me, if I was okay, if I needed medications. He demanded he was going to take me to the university clinic. He told me I wasn't allowed to call my mother, and that only he could deal with this. I told him that he didn't control me, and I ended up calling my mom, obviously, where she told me to go to the clinic and that she would pick me up there. I told Braxton that we could just get an escort by the campus police. The clinic was a few blocks away, and he immediately shut that down and got extremely upset. "No, we are absolutely not going to the police. I'm gonna get an Uber, but we're not going to the police. Don't you even think about calling them." This was extremely alarming to me because why did he want to stay away from the police so badly? He ended up calling an Uber and we got to the clinic finally. He insisted on being right by my side the entire time and wanted me to hold his hand. He kept trying to rub my back and touch me. I told him to stop and that I didn't want him touching me and for him to just leave. He insisted on staying. There wasn't really much I could do, so I dealt with it until my mother came to get me. I was extremely tense and kept my hands to myself and just sat still. After I left, he followed up with multiple texts, asking if I was okay and if I could keep him updated. I ignored all of his messages. Towards the end of the semester, a mutual friend we had in that class messaged me, asking if Braxton had ever made me feel uncomfortable. I told her the truth, and the multiple instances that I immediately got bad vibes from him. Not even 5 minutes after I sent the message to her, Braxton starts blowing up my phone. Calling, texting, leaving voicemails. He kept threatening me, saying he was going to find me, and as soon as he did, that it was over for me. He said I had ruined his life, and that he hated me and that I was a horrible person. He was going to show me what I deserved the next time he saw me, and that I had no idea what was coming for me. His voicemails were so full of rage. His voice was even shaking because of how angry he was, and he was yelling his heart out on one voicemail, and in the next sobbing about why I didn't love him back, how I could betray him like this. Obviously, I didn't go to school that day, and his hundreds of voicemails and texts alternated between rage and apologies, and every emotion in between. It was terrifying. The only reason I did not block this guy or tell anyone about him was because I was terrified he would do something to me. He would remind me that if I was scared of him now, he would give me a reason to be scared later, either if I went to the police or tried distancing myself more. He found every single one of my study spots. I'm a commuter, so I would study and stay at many different coffee shops, and if I wasn't at the ones I usually stayed at, he would message me saying that he would find me if I didn't tell him where I was. He told me that if I ever went to the police that he would give me a reason not to. Things like that. He also shared with me that he would fantasize about me and how badly he wanted me. He said he loved the way I smelled and even wanted to take pieces of my hair to keep at home. It was awful. At the very end of the semester, I completely stopped talking to him, and he seemed to have gotten the hint. I moved seats in class, and he didn't seem to bother me after I made it evident I wanted nothing to do with him. On the last week of semester, he started to take pictures of me from across campus and send them to me with multiple numbers. He would say things like, "You're gorgeous today. I love you so much. I just wish you loved me back. You'll pay for this. Your betrayal to me and humankind." On the very last day, I had gotten on my commuter bus and was seated and on my way home. I got a text from him with a video of me getting onto the bus that said, "See you soon, darling." I was paranoid for weeks afterwards. Luckily, nothing had ever happened since then. He never texted me again, and I hadn't seen him at all after last semester. He deleted all of his social medias. Hopefully, he moved away or graduated. Honestly, I just hope he is far, far away. The other night, I was driving in the center lane of a 3-lane city street. All of a sudden, a car comes up into my right blind spot and almost slams into me. I look over and it's swerving in and out of the lane, braking abruptly. I honk, and I look over to see if the driver is possibly distracted, and I see that the man is driving while drinking something out of a brown bottle. The man then comes up to my side and is screaming at the top of his lungs. Not wanting to get involved in this whole situation, I made a lane change to the leftmost lane to try and get away from the man. I could still hear him screaming, so I turn on my rear view camera and I see the man swerve across 2 lanes from the rightmost to get behind me. He starts speeding up, as if he's trying to ram me from behind. Once I see him inches from my bumper, I decided to run the red light I'm stopped at and make a right turn in front of the 2 lanes of traffic beside me, in the hopes that he'll just leave me alone. I look at my rear view camera again, and I can see that the man is following me, trying to hit me from behind yet again. I panicked. I sped off on a side street, but I looked back to see he just wouldn't let up. He was swerving in the lanes behind me, trying to keep up. In the distance, I saw a freeway on-ramp, so I decided to speed over in hopes of losing him on the freeway. The on-ramp has 2 lanes that merge into one. I pass a car prior to the merge, thinking that car will create a buffer between me and the man chasing me. When I look back into my camera, I see that the man is driving in the shoulder, on the brush to the right side of the on-ramp, in order to pass the other car and catch up to me. At this point, I was driving close to 100 miles per hour, scared for my life, so I slow down and dial 911. I explain the situation to the dispatcher, and she recommends that I try to get away to safety. The man caught up to me though, and begins coming up to the right side of me on the freeway. He repeatedly tries to swerve his car into me, as if to ram me or run me off the road. I slow down in the hopes that he'll pass me up, but he slows down too, and his wife in the passenger seat throws a bottle at my car. For a second I lose visibility. The car is covered in a brown, foamy liquid. I think to myself, surely this is the extent of his road rage. I look over and it seems as if he's continuing on the freeway. Ready to get away, I pull off onto the next freeway exit, thinking I can now just leave the situation. As I do this, the man sees me and makes a 4-lane change onto the exit ramp and tries to ram me once again at the freeway exit. I'm then forced to speed through the city streets, and I finally end up at a red light trapped next to the man. I look over at the man and roll down my window. He's screaming at me. "Why the fuck do you honk at me, you bitch? Are you trying to make me look like a bad father in front of my kids? You want to go?" His wife was also yelling at me, saying, "Why would you honk at him in front of my kids?" I look into the back seat, and I see 2 children in car seats. Since I'm on speaker with the dispatcher, she hears all of this and tells me to just try to get away. At this point, I was done. I just want to get away from this man. So I make a U-turn to head back onto the freeway. He follows me once again and almost hits a plastic construction lane barrier to do so. He's still trying to hit me from behind. Once I get onto the overpass to get onto the freeway, I glance at him to the side of me and see he's holding something up in my direction. Suddenly I hear a very loud bang. In that moment, the dispatcher on the phone yells, "Did he shoot you? Are you okay?" Thinking I've been shot, I start screaming that he's going to kill me. Realizing that running away isn't working, I stop and the man speeds off. Luckily there's no broken glass and I'm not injured in any way. The dispatcher tells me to pull off to a nearby safe location, so I go to the parking lot of a nearby mall. I tell the dispatcher the make, color, and model of the car, as well as a partial license plate. The whole time I drive there, I was concerned that the man could be following me again, but they sent an officer over immediately to file a police report. In waiting for the officer, I realized that my car's cameras are always recording, so I hit the save button. The officer comes over and I tell him my story, describing everything in detail. I also tell him that I may have footage of the whole thing. We take a walk around my car, and for the most part there's no damage. The officer then informs me that because I'm not injured, and because there's no damage to the car, there isn't really anything that can be done. I ask him if it was an assault. He says because the bottle hit my car and not me, that it's not. I ask him if it's reckless driving. He says that here in California, that's only a misdemeanor, and that it requires the presence of a CHP officer to convict. I then ask him if it could be considered an attempted murder, because he was trying to ram me, but he says that this is just plain old road rage and there's not much that can be done. At most, the officer says that once he has a complete license plate, an officer can go out and talk to him, I guess. I ask him if the potential footage could be helpful in getting this man reprimanded in some way, and he only tells me to send me the highlights and necessary screenshots. At the end of all this, I'm extremely shaken up. I eventually went home and reviewed the footage captured by my car. Luckily, I have the entire thing recorded. The moment he almost hits me, his wife throwing the bottle, his face as he's yelling at me and his license plate, even him trying to ram me. It's all recorded. A few days later, the officer called me and confirmed the license plate I had in the video. A week and a half has passed, and there's been no update. While I understand that the law is the law, it's unacceptable to me that this man could be so overtly aggressive on the road, threatening my life and the lives of his children and the lives of everyone else on the road, with no sort of punishment. I was genuinely scared for my life, and in the process both he and I endangered the others on the road. Ultimately, this has left me feeling very disappointed with the system. An act of violence was committed, and due to technicalities the other driver gets off. I tried to keep my retelling as factual as possible, but honestly it was a really terrifying experience. Even in the past few days I still feel a bit hesitant to be an aggressive driver, and I'm not comfortable honking. I really wish I could say this didn't get to me, but it has. One odd detail is that the man was taking pictures of my car before the bang happened. What could that possibly be for?
Portis Media.
Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight we're going to be venturing into the dark interiors of cabins in the woods. I'm also joined by my good friend and fellow narrator, Warren James, from his channel, A Warning to the Curious. He has some very good content over on his channel, and it would mean a lot to me if at the end of the video, you would follow the link on screen and in the description to check him out. I'm sure you'll enjoy his works. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I am an au pair in Sweden and spend most of my summer weekends in my family's summer house, which is out in the archipelago outside of Stockholm. Breathtakingly beautiful place, but boonies don't even begin to cover it. The nearest neighbor is about a 30-minute brisk walk away. And after that, there's nothing except ocean and thick, terrifying forest. This particular night was date night for my parents, so I was left with the two children alone out in the terrifying murder house. There are two houses on the property, one main house and the other is a guest house, where of course I got to sleep all alone. It's literally 2 meters from the ocean. The game plan was to go exploring in the forest, which I had never done alone with the children, only with the parents, and then walk to pick up my boyfriend from the bus stop. He would stay with us until our parents got home from their date, and then my boyfriend and I would go to sleep in the guest house. So while in the house, I kept getting the jitters. Things were definitely stranger, and it wasn't just because I was alone with 2 children. I grew up in the forest, but several times we heard the birds calling out these weird distress call noises, and big flocks would appear. A long time before we were even close enough to scare them. And there were big, thudding footsteps nearby. I was terrified of there being a big moose or something. We came to a little hidden lake, and then things got even weirder. Though the place is unpopulated for miles, there was a woman sitting on a rock opposite us, about 60 feet away. She was naked and wet, as though she had been swimming, even though the water was much too cold for that. When she saw us, she stood up and did this weird pacing thing, like she would get too close to the water and then back away, then move close again, like she wanted to cross and come towards us, but there was the obvious lake barrier in the way. The kids were mildly worried, and it wasn't before long that I ushered them back the way we'd came, in order for us to make our way out of the forest. On the road to pick up my boyfriend, I had the oddest sensation of being watched. I was really terrified actually, but we met him with no incident and returned to the cabin just as the sun was setting. We gave the kids dinner, and just as they were curling up with the Swedish comic book, the main door slammed open. I remember thinking it was a real person. There was a heavy footfall, and then bam, like someone had stomped and flung open the door. But there was no one there. My boyfriend went out and had a look around. Nothing. It must have been the wind, of course. Right? It's always the wind. While we were in bed reading the story, we could hear skittering around and clawing from underneath where we were. I knew for a fact that rats and other rodents camped out at the other end of the house, because that's where the kitchen was. But whatever. I had a really awful feeling in the pit of my stomach, but my rational boyfriend promised me it was a fox or weasel, and not to get worked up. Fast forward to 3 a.m. I had to pee. My boyfriend and I were in the guest house. My bosses had come home long ago. I'm a badass and pee outside with no problems, so I stumbled out of the darkness and squatted down outside the guest house to pee. And it was right after, when I straightened up and adjusted my shirt, that I got that awful feeling of dread. It was the same one I had in the forest. The one I had when I was on my way to see my boyfriend. I had it while we were camped out inside the house. I had felt just fine in the guest house with my boyfriend, but now that feeling was back. Behind the guest house is a steep hill at about a 45-degree angle, and on that hill sits what we call the ghost house. It was the house of an old soldier in the 1600s, and now it just sits there all terrifying and vacant. There's a trail going from the ghost house to the main summer home, and my boss had lit the trail with dim, useless solar lamps. You wouldn't be able to read by the light of the lamps, but the idea was to light your way up the hill and not trip and die over a tree root or something. I could sense a presence moving up the trail. That means something moving from the main house to the ghost house. I squinted in the dark and saw a shape of a person, but that wasn't right, because by the solar light you can see color, jeans or a shirt or jacket, and ours all had reflectors on them. But this was just a black shadow. I thought an animal perhaps, but then ruled it out as it walked on 2 legs, walking really fast and smoothly. But then it slowed and seemed to notice me. I was actually terrified. Good thing I had just peed, right? But then my intuition told me to commence stare down, and so I did. I was fighting to see in the dark, and just when I couldn't focus, I realized there were 2 very softly illuminated eyes on its face, and they were on me. It slowed down to a stroll, and I could see the eyes changing tint from a bluish to a yellowish glow based on what they were in relation to the solar lamps. They were catching light. So I started. It was going so slow now that this felt surreal, and I could hear twigs snapping and other noises that a real-life, non-imagined creature makes. I remember actually thinking, this isn't a hallucination. It's walking on the ground. And then the weirdest part. Instead of moving at a normal, relative height, the way human eyes or animal eyes would, the eyes start kind of hovering. They were 6 feet off the ground, suddenly would dip down to 4 feet, then back up to 5, and they never left me. But the direction this thing was moving in never changed. It kept going up the hill. The eyes and the figure faded out into the darkness once the solar lamps ended, and I went back into the guest house and locked the door. I heard nothing else that night. My boyfriend slept through everything, but early in the morning he woke up whimpering from a nightmare. And that's the only time anything has ever happened at that summer house, and I was there collectively for a month.
We have around 200 acres of woodland. Me and my dad live on the front end of the property, and on the back side of the property, we have a rustic hunting cabin. No water or electricity. The back end of our property also sits on the edge of a state forest. You have to travel something like 12 miles before you reach any kind of road or trail. Several years back, during deer hunting season, my dad and I were sitting around the campfire back at our hunting cabin. It was near dusk, and we were done hunting for the day, just relaxing. We both saw something moving in the sky that caught our attention. A larger purple shape, about the size of a small car, was floating along just above the tree line. It was moving rather quickly. It came from the direction of the front end of our property, came towards us, went above our heads, and continued back towards the state forest until it disappeared from sight. If I had to guess, I would say it was moving about 15 miles per hour. It didn't look like a cloud, but it didn't look quite solid either. We both saw it happen, and just kind of remained silent for a minute, and then confirmed that we both saw it. Neither of us had any good guesses as to what it could have been. Only thing I can come up with is swamp gas, but that's not a good explanation, I don't think. That's my strange hunting story. It hasn't been enough to keep me out of the woods, but creepy all the same.
A bit of backstory before I start this. I live in northern British Columbia, Canada, and a couple of years back, my friend had invited me to come with him, his mum, and his sister to a resort by a lake, an hour and a half or so out of town. This was at the end of June and the beginning of July. This so-called resort wasn't exactly what I anticipated. It's a main log building where you check in, but it's also a restaurant too. A few log cabins and some spots down by the lake for RVs and stuff to park in. There's a highway that you turn off of onto the lot where the check-in building is. And to the right of the highway is the forest for miles, as well as everywhere else around that area. The only thing that stands out is the highway, which cuts through the woods. Around the lake, there's some houses and whatnot, but generally speaking, if it isn't a long weekend, there aren't too many people out there. The cabins and RVs area are separated and away from the main building, about a 5 to 8 minute walk away. A little bit past the main building, there's a clearing where you could sit at a couple of tables that look like they haven't been used in about 10 years, as there are vines and grass that have grown around them. And about 10 feet into the woods past those tables, there are 2 small lagoons surrounded by an old wire fence. The lagoons and table area are important for later. We got there in the evening, unloaded the car, got acquainted with the log cabin, which was really nice by the way, and then we went out to explore around. Not too many interesting things happened on our first day, as we didn't explore a whole lot before dark. Skip to the next day, and it's cloudy and rainy, which we actually were hoping for, as that meant that there were very few people at the resort, and we would get free reign over it. We explore down by the lake and around the cabin area more thoroughly, and eventually make our way up to the clearing where the tables are located. We look at the tables, and see that they haven't been touched in what looks like a long time from the amount of grass and weeds that has built up around it. And while investigating, I took notice that around 50 feet or so into the backwoods, there was what looked to be a clear area. We slid down into this ditch-like area, which was probably around 8-foot difference in elevation from the nearest table area, and trampled through the brush. We eventually came to the spot, which we're pretty sure are lagoons due to the way they're constructed. We noticed there was a wire fence around it. We walked around the area planning to leave until we saw what looked like a spot where a large animal had walked over the fence and crushed a portion of it. Not really paying attention to the fact that a large animal may have been in the area, we dismissed those thoughts and said that it was probably bent like this for a long time. We tooled around the area looking at the lagoons, and eventually we left, planning to come back the next day with big rocks to throw into the water, as it was getting time to eat dinner. But the next day, we came back to the tables planning to go into the lagoon area once again. But before we had a chance to go down the ditch, we stopped because of a noise. This is what triggered the rest of the events in this story. The noises we heard were those of walking over small twigs, snapping them in the lagoon/ditch area we had traveled the previous day. Keep in mind, those footsteps weren't there before. We stuck around for about 10 minutes or so, until we got hit with an intense feeling of dread. After this, we said screw this, and went back to our cabin where we played poker for the rest of the night. While playing, we discussed the events that had taken place, and eventually laughed it off, saying it was probably just a bear passing through, or rabbits in the area. The next day it was raining heavily, and much darker than the past couple of days. We left our cabin and planned to go into the lagoon area later, but we wanted to chill around a medium forested area close to the cabins that I forgot to mention at the beginning of this story. As I previously said, after we had originally gone into the lagoon area, things started getting weird. We were messing around in the woods, breaking big sticks on trees, when we had heard what sounded to be someone doing the same thing about 200 feet away in the direction we were facing. It was hard to judge how far exactly it was, because of the way the forest carries sound, but it was pretty far in front of us. We wouldn't have cared too much about this until we took notice of where it actually was. The entire area around there and beyond is all forested, and having someone in those forests along with us that far in, and in the less than favorable weather, with very few people at the resort at that time, is unlikely. We decided to leave the area and come back later during the evening. Spoiler alert, that wasn't a great idea. So after leaving that area, we went around to the lagoon area and listened for a few minutes. We couldn't hear anyone walking, so we assumed that we were right about it being a passing forest creature. Not even 10 steps in, and I tell my friend to stop moving. We both stop and listen. We hear what sounds like the steps again, but as they're coming in louder and faster, we get that same overbearing feeling of dread. We hightail it out of there, spooked as hell, and we book it back to our cabin. Later that evening, we returned to the forest clearing from earlier, where we had heard the branch against the tree noise in the day. We again started smacking branches against trees, this time not hearing anything. But as I turned to my left, something caught my eye. There was what appeared to be a person standing behind a tree, and I saw them duck behind it when they noticed that I noticed them. I nearly crapped myself as I yelled to my friend that we needed to get out of there, and we sprinted back into the cabin. We returned the next day, and I took a picture of where the figure was standing. Later that night, while we're sitting in the loft area where our beds are, we have a discussion about what happened that day. There's much less joking this time, and we're trying to make sense of what happened. We started with the branch hitting the tree noise. At first, we tried to dismiss it by saying it was an echo, but remembered that the echoes weren't prominent at the time, especially 5 seconds after hitting the tree. Only I saw the hooded figure in the same area later, but I knew it was a person, or at least think it was a person. We weren't too sure about that, so we moved on to talking about the lagoon/table area. Nothing really too interesting came up in that conversation. We left the next day as our booking had ended. This isn't the end of the story, however. We came back last year around the same time, but we had brought another friend with us. We showed him around and briefed him about what had happened the previous year, and he took it with a grain of salt, as any sane person would. This eventually changed over the next 3 days. The activity this time wasn't so much in the side forest where I'd seen the hooded figure, and where me and my friends heard the tree noises, although we did hear the returning knocks again, but in the lagoon/table area. I'll skip to the juicy stuff. So after showing our other friend the lagoon area, we decided to enter it after not hearing any noises. All went well, and we returned the next day. This time the footsteps were there once again, but a bit closer than before. We left that area, but returned around an hour later. We were determined to see what was repelling us out of there, but to get in we had to be quiet. Slowly, we went down the ditch and to the lagoons without anything hearing us, and we didn't see anything there. We heard something snap a little bit away, so without making too much noise, we got out of there. The next and final day before we had to leave once again, we returned to the table/lagoon area, where we were planning to go to the lagoons again. But when we were at the table area, we had heard something new. It was a sort of screeching noise, but it sounded like a person almost. At first, we thought it was a person who had injured themselves and was calling for help, but I made everyone stop and just listen before doing anything. We listened to it, and from what I heard, it sounded like a mixture between a person yelling, an angry cat hissing, and a shallow dog bark. My 2 friends decided that they wanted to get closer and investigate the sound, while I was opposed to it. We went regardless, but I stayed much further away as my gut was telling me to get out of there. We threw rocks near the area from where the sound was, in hopes to flush it out of its hiding spot, and when that didn't work, we got much too close. We were right at the edge of a ditch close to the tables, and when I got as close as my friends did, something happened. The thing that was making the sound had thrown either a large log or had knocked down a tree, judging by the sound. But I didn't exactly stick around to investigate. I turned tail and bolted down as fast as my legs would carry me. I was probably about 15 feet away from my friends, as my danger reflexes were faster, and it registered to me faster that I needed to get the hell out of there. We were about 100 feet away when we came to a stop. Nothing came after us, but the sounds then resumed. We walked around the main building, and when we came around, there was a black bear standing there. We let out a sigh of relief, as we thought we had been spooked by a bear. But then we shifted back to our previous feelings of dread, when the bear did the same thing as us, and got out of there as fast as it could. We didn't investigate further, and ran back to our cabin. Nothing further happened as we left the following day, due to the reservation being over. I don't know what the lagoon/table creature is, but I sure as hell know it's not any bear. The other thing in the forest, I'm still not sure about. I think that they're separate things, as the woodsman, or tree knocker as we've nicknamed it, is more elusive and seems to be luring us into that area, while the screecher is very territorial and aggressive. I've tried to find things online about similar experiences in the area, but I've come up empty, which is another reason why I'm sharing this. Does anyone have any ideas about what this could be? I have no clue what's going on. Despite the strange things going on there, the location is very beautiful. The cabins are nice despite the spring beds, and the food at the restaurant is also quite tasty. The place is called Purdon Lake Resort. If you look it up on Google, it's the one with the green roof. I hope you enjoyed the story.
Years ago, me and my family were on vacation. I was pretty young at the time. We were staying in a rental cabin around 25-30 minutes outside of town. We stayed there as it seemed very affordable compared to other similar cabins in the area. When we first arrived, it did seem like a nice place. It had 2 floors and was very spacious, but many of the appliances were outdated. Come sunset, the place was lit up by the sunset in a beautiful yet surreal way. It was so quiet and so bright inside, it was surreal and strangely a bit eerie. After the sun had set and it became night, I started getting scared and paranoid, yet I had no idea why. I had never felt that way before or since. I had a hard time falling asleep, but I did, and nothing strange happened. We were out doing activities for most of the next day, as a family on a vacation would. We returned to our cabin around sunset. I decided to get in a hot tub that sat on a porch overlooking the hills in the sunset. But once again, I started getting scared and paranoid, and I went inside. We played a board game together. After that, we were all getting ready to go to bed. Everyone acted a bit strangely, though. My dad decided to go sleep on a couch downstairs. He told me to calm down, as I was still scared. He said he was not scared, and went downstairs to sleep. I looked downstairs and saw he had a metal fireplace tool, I forget what they're called, hidden under the couch, as if he wanted to use it as a weapon. This was strange. He had never done that before, and he still denies he ever did. I now believe he was also scared and paranoid. I went into my bed and tried to sleep. I did fall asleep, but then I awoke, lights flashing in my eyes for several seconds before everything became clear again. I had slept with no dreams and had no idea how much time had passed. I looked at the clock and saw that a mere 20 minutes had passed. I tried to sleep again, but the same thing happened over and over again until I forgot how many times I had woken up and what day and time it was. I eventually got out of bed and saw it had only been a few hours since I had first gotten in bed. I was confused and scared, so I went downstairs to watch television to try to clear my mind. There was an old TV downstairs, and when I went to turn it on, I heard somebody speaking in a language I did not understand. I stepped back to see where it was coming from, and it seemed to originate from the speakers of the TV that was turned off. I started trying to think of what the noise might be. It sounded like people talking in Russian in some sort of code. It reminded me of radio stations where people occasionally talk in code nobody understands. I did not understand what the noise was, though. I went upstairs to tell my mom, and she said she heard the same thing coming from a TV in her room that was turned off. I was so scared, I convinced my family to check out early. We stayed in a hotel in the area, and nothing strange happened again. I never have alcohol or prescription drugs or any other drugs. I have never had any hallucinations or mental illness in my entire life. My entire family was affected by strange events at this cabin. So, does anyone have any explanations? Whatever happened was not because of any drugs any of us knowingly took. None of us have any mental illnesses. I have tried to find an explanation and could not, so I resorted to this. Unfortunately, I have no evidence, as I did not have anything to record with all those years ago. Please let me know if you have a logical explanation.
My family have a cabin. It's actually a 2-story house up in the Appalachian Mountains, but we call it a cabin. We share it with our extended family, and I've got the absolute best memories up there. But the house is nearly 200 years old, and when you're up there all alone, or sometimes in the dead of night, it just feels off. And nearly everyone has experienced some sort of bizarre experience there. The house sits on 350 acres, and one day, my grandfather went out hunting on the property. The sun was just beginning to set when he saw some sort of big black creature sitting near a tree line. It and my grandfather stared at each other, and my grandfather fired a shot into the air, hoping to scare it. The creature stood up on its hind legs and walked back into the forest. He said the face was very cat-like, and it had a slinking gait with its long black tail. He was an avid hunter his whole life and knew of every kind of creature that lived in those mountains, but he'd never seen such a weird creature as that. And then, a couple of days later, as my immediate family and I were visiting, I saw some weird creature through my bedroom window at night. It looked like an enormous black wolf. When we locked eyes, it ran straight at me, and I instinctively jumped back. When I looked out again, it was gone. But my mum had an experience that chilled me to the bone. For some reason, she was spending the night in the room that I usually stay in when I go up there. I don't remember the reasoning for it, but I hadn't joined her on the trip that time. She awoke in the middle of the night to a strange tapping noise against the hardwood floor. She stayed absolutely still and listened as the tapping turned to what sounded like claws scraping against the floor. They started from one end of the room, traveled across the floor under the bed she was sleeping in, and ended in front of the closed closet door. She was on her side facing the closet, but she kept her eyes closed and scarcely breathed. She says it was the most terrified she has ever been. Apparently, this clawing noise continued off and on throughout the whole night, and she didn't really get any sleep. There was even a moment that it seemed to hesitate next to her bed, and she could feel something staring at her mere inches from her face. So yeah, those are a few of the experiences that I know of that have happened there, but it's such a lovely house, and I have the most fantastic and wonderful memories from there. And I've spent the night in that very same room that my mum had the terrifying experience in many times since, even as recently as last weekend, and I've never heard or seen anything while sleeping there.
A group of friends were staying at this remote cabin that one of my friend's cousins owned. There were no roads leading to the cabin, and it was a good 3/4 day hike from where you parked the cars. I couldn't go at the same time as everyone else due to work obligations, so I decided to head up the same day, but later. It would mean I would have to camp for a night by myself. The latter part of the trail is too dangerous to be taken at night, especially by someone who doesn't know it. I didn't care. I was kind of looking forward to it, as I've never camped alone before. So, I was in the middle of these woods when the sun went down. I got my camp set up in this small clearing, probably 40 feet across, get my campfire going, and pitch my small, one-person tent. Do all that camping stuff, like cooking hot dogs on a stick over the fire, and s'mores. I probably stayed up for a good 2 or 3 hours after dark. It was mid-autumn, so the days were somewhat short. The entire time, I thought I heard stuff moving in the woods on the edge of the clearing. I didn't think anything of it at first because the woods are full of animals. But as the night went on, I realized that whatever it was just circling the clearing over and over. Once I started paying attention, it made 4 or 5 laps around before I decided to get up and investigate. The noise stopped as soon as I stood up, and I thought I heard some sound going away through the woods. I just shrugged it off, thinking it was some fox that was curious, and that got scared when I stood up. I decided it's time to sleep, douse the fire, and climb into my tent. I start to doze off and stay in that half asleep, half awake state for a while. I normally hear weird stuff when I'm in this state, so I don't think much of it when I hear a voice. Something wakes me all the way up, though, and I realize the voice is real and right outside my tent. It's just above a whisper, and I'm not sure if it was in another language or if they were just speaking English in such a way that I couldn't understand them. I lay there for some time, I don't know how long, listening and waiting for something to happen. There is just enough moonlight to light up the walls of the tent, so I can see when a hand presses into the wall of my tent down near my foot. This freaks me out, and I sit up quickly. Whoever was outside the tent tore ass out of there, like running, full sprint, through the woods. I get out of the tent and shine my flashlight around and see nothing. I was expecting there to be a bloody handprint on the tent, but nope. I didn't sleep that night, packed up camp at first light that morning, and booked it to the cabin.
This was on my parents' property a couple of years ago. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to go on a short hike at around midnight. I was walking down a beaten path with my rifle-mounted flashlight pointing forwards. It was really misty. I could see the silhouettes of trees, but nothing detailed. I got to my uncle's one-room cabin about 1/4 mile from my house and took a seat on his picnic table. After sitting there for a while, I got up and turned to my right and took about 5 steps into the grass. I pointed my flashlight, and into the mist, I could see 2 yellow predator eyes glowing at about stomach level, not 10 feet away from me. I stood there for at least 5 long minutes, just looking into its eyes with my rifle pointed right between them. They didn't move or make a sound, just blinking every couple of seconds. I stared back silently while trying to keep my composure. All at once, the eyes were gone. I walked forwards to where it must have been standing, and I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything. No rustle of grass, no twig breaking, no dent in the ground. It was just gone. I ended up walking back home after that. I never did see its body, just its floating eyes.
My grandpa was telling me a story. I believe it happened in the 60s, near the Sandy Bay Aboriginal Reserve, which is in southern Manitoba. It was midwinter, and Manitoba gets plenty of snow. My grandpa told me his two friends, a wife and husband, were walking from their car to their house, carrying all of their luggage. It was just their cabin, not their house, so they were carrying the luggage up to the cabin. The first thing they noticed was a bright, bright light shining into the cabin. It illuminated the entire cabin and was a fluorescent shade of icy blue. The husband thought he saw the silhouette of a strange, tall humanoid in the cabin. It was lanky and very tall, standing alone before it walked out of sight. Quickly he ran into the cabin with his wife. They searched the cabin, and there was nothing. So the wife went back out to grab more luggage. The husband said he heard a shriek from outside and quickly ran out to make sure she was okay. He was shocked to find her footprints leading up to the car, yet she was about 25 feet away from the car in the woods, with no tracks leading towards her. If she were to walk out there herself, her tracks would obviously be there. He ran out to her. She was distraught and hollering and screaming, and her eyes were glazed over. He took her in and she refused to speak. She was admitted to a mental hospital soon after, and to this day has the same glazed over eyes, and she still can't speak. She experienced a horrible trauma out there, and I believe it's because of whatever the humanoid creature was. My grandpa still talks to her husband sometimes, and I believe he visited her about 30 years ago at the hospital. Horrifying. Horrible.
On a 14-day canoe trip, we rolled up on this creepy abandoned fishing cabin. It was falling apart. We got out to explore and looked around. There were these ropes, or lines, hanging from tree to tree. And also there was a dead, rotting moose on the dock. The cabin was empty, except for some shirts hanging up. And we began to realize it probably wasn't abandoned. There was a set of children's shoes in perfect condition, sitting outside on a picnic table or something like that. Same thing with a toothbrush. Fishing poles sitting upright and in good condition, when they would have been blown over easily in the winds. It was just a bunch of little things that pointed towards someone having been there recently. But it was all a lot creepier than it sounds. There was a constant feeling like someone was watching us, combined with just how run down and dilapidated the cabin was. I kept turning around as we paddled off, expecting to see someone hiding in the trees, watching us.
My father and I were in a cabin in the woods with his girlfriend and her two kids. It was late afternoon, and my dad's girlfriend, Kathy, was making delicious enchiladas. As it was such a nice day, we had left the door open. In hindsight, this was probably a bad idea. Anyway, we sat down to eat dinner, and in walks this bear. Cue lots of screaming from us kids, as everyone leaps to their feet. Kathy was the only one to act. Mama bear versus bear, and she grabbed her chair like a lion tamer and screamed, "Back, bear, back," as she advanced towards it. The bear was intimidated and backed up out of the cabin onto the porch, which is when Kathy slammed the door shut and locked it. The bear hung around for like an hour. We watched it through the windows as it lumbered over to the chaise lounge, where my dad had napped earlier that day. It began to gnaw and maul his pillow, while my dad stood there murmuring, "Jesus Christ, it likes my smell. It likes my smell," over and over again. My dad is a big, burly, no-nonsense guy, but he was completely freaked out. Hi, this is Warren James. I hope you'll check out